Well, if you have been around for the last number of weeks, and if you haven't, I'll just give you the quick update. We've been in this short summer series that we're entitling simply The Significance of the Small. We talked about the wise woman of Tekoa. We talked about Tamar. And last week, a guy by the name of Agur. And this morning, we want to pause and reflect on a young, unnamed slave girl whose contribution to Scripture is a mere 2.5 verses. And one might legitimately ask, how can you actually craft a sermon out of 2.5 verses? In the story, which many of you will probably know, she's a mere tiny footnote in the actual bigger story. I hope you stay with me, and I hope to show you that there's some pretty significant pieces that we can learn from this young girl. Now, if you've been in the church for many years, and I know many of you have, if you can go all the way back to flannel graph Sunday school, you will remember the story of Naaman. He was that chap in the Old Testament that had leprosy. The story is in 2 Kings chapter 5, and it reads as a pretty engaging story on many levels. So I'm going to read parts of it. You can follow along, and I'll have it up on the screen behind me. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him, the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier. This is a great Anabaptist story. But he had leprosy. Now, when I read those verses, I kind of visualize Naaman as a man's man. He's strong, probably tall, muscular. He's an army general after all. He's great in the sight of the king. He's highly regarded. But he has a weak point. He has leprosy. Now, there's a lot of speculation in the Old Testament around what exactly that disease was. It could have been anything from a really bad case of psoriasis, some kind of fungal infection, or maybe, in fact, in the language of today, it was actually Hansen's disease, where there were skin lesions, nerve damage, ulcers, that when left unchecked, and of course they had no cure in that time, it often led to burns, cuts, infections, because you didn't notice when your limb was being assaulted. And it often led to permanent disfiguration. If Naaman had been in the camp of Israel, he would have been declared unclean and put outside the camp. It was a protective measure, I think, for the people within the camp. But there was incredible social and spiritual stigma. He was seen as defiled. Now, I'm going to skip the 2 verses that have our heroine in it, but we'll come back to them. So we move on to verse 4 and 5, where we read this. Naaman went to his master and told him what this girl from Israel had said. By all means, the king said to Aram, or the king of Aram replied, I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. Naaman brings a request to the king. The king says, I can do that. I'll put a letter together. And in his desperation, Naaman pulls together this amazing gift that he wants to give to somebody who's going to heal him. In today's understanding, that was 750 pieces of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. I don't know why the clothing was such a big deal, but it was. He goes to Israel, and he presents the letter of the king to the Israeli king. And we read in verses 6 and 7. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I'm sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me?" Can you imagine having that brought to you? The king says, "Am I God? You want me to heal you of leprosy?" And he thought that there was some kind of a political thing going on, and they were going to take advantage of this situation and continue their exploits into the land of Israel. Well, the prophet Elisha hears of the predicament of his own king. He realizes that the stakes are high, and he says, "Have that man come to me." So we read in verses 8 and 9 and 10, when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to see me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." So Naaman had taken his entourage. He comes to Elisha's door. And oddly, the prophet chooses not to go outside to meet him. Instead, he sends his messenger. And he says to Naaman, "I know who you are. Go to the Jordan River, wash yourself 7 times, and what you're hoping for will actually happen." Naaman is a proud man. He's insulted. In fact, he kind of goes into a state of rage. He wants to leave. He simply says, "Look, we've got better rivers back in our country. If it's all about washing in a river, I can go there. Why would I go to this muddy Jordan River?" Fortunately, his servants intervene. What can it hurt? Do what the prophet says. And so reluctantly, slowly, he goes, dips himself 7 times in the Jordan, and is restored. It says that his skin became clean, like that of a young boy. He's ecstatic. He returns to the man of God. He suddenly becomes a follower of this God. He offers the gifts that he brought, but Elisha again says, "No, thank you. I'm not going to accept a thing in return." Naaman refuses, but he says no. Then Naaman asks a rather odd request. "Could I take several mule-full loads of soil with me? Because when I go back to my land, I want to worship your God on your soil." And the prophet says, "Go in peace." Elisha's servant, Gehazi, listened to all of this. He probably was the intermediary talking. And he thinks to himself, what a missed opportunity. We could use that silver, that gold, those clothes. And so he decides to chase after Naaman. And he concocts a lie. He says, "I've got some guests. Elisha has reconsidered. We'll take at least a small portion of what you've offered." And Naaman gladly gives it to him. And the servant comes back, hides the stuff, comes back into the presence of Naaman, or into the presence of Elisha. And Elisha looks at him and says, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" And there we read in verse 25, "Your servant didn't go anywhere." But Elisha said to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes, or olive groves and vineyards, or flocks, herds, or male and female slaves? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and your descendants forever." Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. Greed had consumed him. Naaman's leprosy clung to Gehazi, and he went out from Elisha's presence as white as snow. That's the classic story. Men, power, pride, healing, greed, and punishment. But I'd like us to return to the footnote, those two verses we passed over, because there's a thread in those verses that we must not miss. You see, there's this young, unnamed slave girl who's the actual heroine. No power, no status, no voice. And the story would not have happened without her. So back to verse 2 and 3. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Now visualize what these verses are telling us. Raiding bands of Aram had been going into Israeli territory, and they took hostages. One of them was a little girl. All kinds of images no doubt go into your mind. I immediately think of some of the schools in different countries in Africa over the last number of years that have been raided, and little boys and little girls taken, often disappearing, never being seen from before. Of course, we think of the story in Israel and Gaza. A little girl stolen from her family. Everything that she knew of, her safety, her known world, is taken from her. No doubt heartbroken, abused, and traumatized. And she's the one that is offered to Naaman's wife as a slave girl. I can't visualize what that would be like if that had been one of my daughters. Ripped from one's home, in the arms of the enemy. But there she is. We can so quickly just pass over that. What can we learn from her? Is there anything that we could surmise? Anything that we can see to be true in her story? I'm fascinated that although she is young, she knew the God of Israel. And she knew of the prophet Elisha, even at a young age. And I wonder, who taught her? Who pointed her to the God of Israel? I note that she must have been traumatized But somehow she rises above that. The loss, the pain, the horror. And you can only assume that in that home, the home of her captor, she is faithful and trusted. Otherwise, there's no way they would have listened to her when she raised her small voice. She was obviously also very observant. She saw the need of Naaman, the warrior, her master's husband. And somehow she chose to raise her voice. No one needed to listen. It could have so easily just been passed over. It must have taken incredible courage and probably at great risk. But she spoke up. She suggested a ray of hope. And I think, what gall, what guts, what courage. She expressed faith in her God, and frankly, she put the prophet on notice. She was hidden, she was observant, she was fearless, she was forgiving, and she pointed her captors towards real love. You see, the main story, the plot, we know. It follows a patriarchal path, one that is so well versed and so well established even in our day. Power, men, pride, a healing, and greed. But I think the real story is so different. It's far more significant. A young female slave. Think about it. The absolute lowest person in any kind of order of power. Seemingly powerless, humble, genuine, generous, loving, pointing others to a person beyond herself. And what a difference she made for Naaman. Which gets me to think about our world, one in which there are also the two competing narratives all the time. There's the way of power, pride, narcissism, greed, hurt, and trauma. And then there's the way of powerlessness, humility, generosity, pointing to a love beyond ourselves, real love. Now, we may feel insignificant. Sometimes we feel insignificant as a church community. We're small. What kind of power, voice do we really have? We may feel insignificant as individuals in a world that's all about power and domination. But the way of Jesus is the way of this unnamed slave girl. Our status is not in inward power or outward power, but in humble love, compassion, and grace, pointing people to our God who has our back. Well, that brings me to a short video that I'd like to show us this morning. Some of you will remember we viewed this at our AGM back in February. It feels more fitting today than it did even then. As already mentioned several times, a dear friend, a worship leader, Brian Dirksen, suddenly succumbed to a very unexpected cancer this week. Very sudden, very tragic. And we thought we needed to acknowledge, and together with, I know, churches around the globe, mention that fact, because his songs, and they will continue on for generations to impact. But the one last video, and I'm not sure 100% if it's the last video he did, but one of the very last, because it just came out early this year, was entitled Shelter. And it gives a great picture, not only to the heart and passion of Brian, but I think it also represents the love and the compassion of this slave girl that we've just been talking about. And I trust it will be our wish as individuals and as a church to live that posture. Not only to be a shelter for those on the margins, but like that unnamed slave girl, to offer to those whom we connect with Jesus' real love. Let's listen.